According to Joel Best, there are 4 types of people in the statistics world. There's the awestruck, which I will represent with Patrick Starr, the naive, which will be represented by SpongeBob SquarePants, the cynical, which will be represented by Squidward Tentacles, and the critical, represented by Sandy Cheeks. First, I would like to talk a little bit about the awestruck. These people often regard statistics as magic and believe that anyone who uses them has magical powers. These people basically avoid all thinking, and they're okay with that. Next, there's the naive. These people are slightly more sophisticated than the awestruck, and Joel Best believes that a great majority of the population is naive when it comes to math. Their biggest issue is innumeracy, which is the inability to deal with numbers. Usually big numbers will blend together. So for example, during the 1980s, activists claimed that 3 million Americans were homeless, while the Reagan administration insisted that actually the number was closer to 300,000. Innumerate people would say, why the fuss? They're both big numbers. But if you break it down to smaller numbers, the difference between 3 million and 300,000 is actually 30 to 3. Personally, I'd like to know if I was going to have to feed 3 or 30 for dinner. Another mistake naive people make is rearranging the wording of a statistic and changing the meaning, creating a mutant statistic. For example, activists for anorexia estimated that 150,000 American women were anorexic and noted that in some cases anorexia could lead to death. This was mutated into the statistic that each year 150,000 women died of anorexia, which was way off. There are actually about 70 deaths per year. Now there are those that are critical. These people are suspicious of statistics. They believe that all numbers are flawed and the flaws are intentional. Flaws in statistics include having too broad of a definition, also known as type 2 error in our book in chapter 10. This gives us too many false positives. For example, defining homelessness as anyone who literally does not own their own home would give you a lot of false positives because there could be people who live with relatives while they look for a home. Another flaw is having too narrow of a definition. This is also known as type 1 error in chapter 10 of our book, giving us too many false negatives. And finally, Joel Best includes common statistical flaws such as selection bias, convenient sampling, and having confounding variables, all found in chapter 2 of our book. And finally, there are those that are critical. These people do not reject all statistics, nor do they accept all statistics. They evaluate them and determine which are good ones and which are bad. They do this by asking 3 basic questions when they encounter new statistics. Number 1, who created it? Number 2, why was it created? And number 3, how was it created? The critical understand that every statistic has its limitations and flaws. They realize stats are how we summarize our crazy lives. Here is an example of a misleading statistic from outside the book. Toddlers who attend preschool exhibit aggressive behavior. This study was made by comparing 4-year-olds' behavior who went to preschool with 4-year-olds' behavior who stayed at home with their mothers. This study measured aggressive behavior as stealing toys, pushing, and fighting. The results showed that children attending preschool were 3 times more likely to be aggressive than those who stayed at home with their mothers. However, the study failed to include that aggressive behavior in 4-year-olds is normal. So actually, the behavior of the 4-year-olds staying at home with their mothers was abnormal. The author's main goal was to teach the reader enough about statistics so that they may fall in the critical thinkers category and be able to do more than just throw up their hands when they're confronted with stat wars. What are stat wars? Well, they're basically conflicts over social statistics. This happens when 2 groups disagree with the statistics being presented by the other group. Disagreement could arise because each of the groups may think that the other's statistics are biased. These groups often include politicians, activists, the media, corporations, researchers, and even charities. For example, has anyone ever heard of Louis Farrakhan and the Million Man March? This was a huge dispute because in 1995, Mr. Farrakhan, a black religious and social leader, also the successor of Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, claimed that he would have 1 million men attend his speaking event in Washington, D.C. However, the day of the event, park police estimated about 400,000 people in attendance from a formula they developed by looking at aerial photos of the park. Farrakhan responded in outrage, charging that, quote, racism, white supremacy, and the hatred of Louis Farrakhan disallows them to give us credit, end quote. A team from Boston University examined the park police photographs and made their own estimate that about 870,000 people were in attendance. However, when the park police and Boston University formulas were each examined, the difference in their estimates came down to how densely packed they assumed the crowd to be. Park police estimated about 3.6 square feet per person, while the Boston University team estimated 1.8 square feet per person, which is about the area you have in a packed elevator. These two estimates were pretty generous towards Farrakhan because most crowds listening to speakers actually have an average of about 5.7 to 8.5 square feet per person. This stat war was just an example of how a critical person would look at the numbers. Instead of thinking the numbers were magic, or simply just accepting the numbers, or even rejecting the numbers right away, we look at them critically and ask 1. Who created it? 2. Why they created it? And 3. How they created it. In this case of the Million Man March, the how question gave us the most insight. So, like our book, Joel Best warns of misleading statistics from Type 1 and Type 2 error in Chapter 10, and biases such as response and selection in Chapter 2, and also confounding variables. But these are not the only ways statistics can be misleading, which is why he encourages everyone to be critical thinkers and always ask themselves 3 questions when confronted with a new statistic. Number 1, who created it? Number 2, why did they create it? And number 3, how did they create it? And that, everybody, is the end of my video on the book Damn Flies and Statistics by Joel Best. I hope you learned a lot. Bye!